Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so you've requested a deep dive into the end of World War II,
Oh, yeah.
but not just like the battles and the treaties.
Right.
You want to understand the big what if. How did three crucial conferences shape the world we live in today?
Yeah.
We're talking Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam.
Big three.
Names you've probably heard, but trust me, the behind-the-scenes story,
Oh, yeah.
full of personality clashes and decisions that still echo in the 21st century.
What's fascinating is that even amidst the victory celebrations of 43,
Yeah.
the seeds of future conflict were already being sown.
Interesting.
These conferences weren't just about ending a war, but about shaping the peace.
Right.
And the visions each nation had for that peace
Okay.
were vastly different.
Okay, so let's rewind to 1943.
Okay.
The war is raging, but the tide is turning.
Yeah.
Tehran is where Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt meet face-to-face for the first time,
That's true.
each a titan in their own right.
Oh, yeah.
Can only imagine the tension in the room.
Lots of tension.
What was the main point of contention at this stage in the war?
Well, on the surface, it was Stalin's demand for a second front in Europe.
Okay.
He was insistent that the US and UK needed to relieve the pressure on Soviet forces fighting the Nazis in the East.
Right.
But this wasn't just military strategy.
Okay.
It exposed a deep-seated pattern in Russian history.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
For centuries, Russia has felt vulnerable without geographic buffers.
Okay.
Think about it. Vast open plains
Right.
have been invasion routes time and again.
Right.
Stalin's insistence on a second front wasn't just about winning the current fight. It was about securing their borders for the future,
Okay.
creating a buffer zone to prevent history from repeating itself.
So this desire for a buffer zone, this directly ties into what happens next, right? The liberation of Eastern Europe, which played out largely at Yalta in 1945.
That's right.
This is where Stalin's promises get a little murky.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
The situation in Poland is a perfect example. Okay.
Stalin pledged to allow free elections there,
Okay.
a major concession to Roosevelt and Churchill, who were adamant about spreading democracy.
Right.
But the devil's in the details,
Okay.
or rather the lack thereof.
Okay.
The agreement was vague on how these elections would be run, leaving a lot of room for interpretation.
And that's where the historical debate gets really interesting.
It does.
Was Stalin truly intending democratic elections, or was this the beginning of the Iron Curtain descending? Intentionally or not?
This is something historians still debate.
Right.
Some argue Stalin's promise was never genuine,
Okay.
pointing to how quickly he installed communist regimes in Poland and elsewhere once the war ended.
Oh, so it's like a bait and switch.
Potentially.
Okay.
But there's another layer to consider.
Okay.
We can't discount the devastation the Soviet Union experienced during World War II.
Of course not.
Millions dead, their economy in ruins.
Right.
From Stalin's perspective, having friendly governments in Eastern Europe wasn't just ideological.
Right. It was a matter of national security after such trauma.
It's like that feeling when you've been through something awful.
Right.
You might want to build walls up,
Yeah.
even if it means sacrificing some freedoms to feel safe again.
It's true.
Yeah.
Now, whether that justified his actions is another debate entirely.
Right.
But understanding that context is crucial when unpacking these conferences.
Yeah.
It wasn't just good versus evil.
Right.
These were complex figures reacting to a world on fire.
And this backdrop of suspicion and clashing ideologies only intensifies as we move to Potsdam in July of 45.
Yeah.
But by then, the game had fundamentally changed.
It had.
Roosevelt was gone, Truman was at the helm,
Right.
and the U.S. had a new, terrifying ace up its sleeve,
It's true.
the atomic bomb.
And the timing of its first test, just as the Potsdam Conference began, was no coincidence.
Wow.
Truman saw this new weapon as leverage,
Okay,
a way to reshape the conversation with Stalin.
that's fascinating. So how did Truman wield this newfound atomic power? Was it a straight-up do as we say or else situation?
It was more nuanced than that.
Okay.
While he informed Stalin about the successful test, he never explicitly threatened to use the bomb against the Soviet Union.
Okay.
But the implication was clear. The U.S. now possessed a weapon capable of unimaginable destruction.
You can't just casually mention something like that and expect it not to change the entire mood in the room.
Right.
What was Stalin's reaction?
Oh, well, we don't have a transcript of his inner thoughts.
Right.
You can bet it added a whole new layer of complexity to their already tense relationship.
Yeah.
Many historians argue this moment right here at Potsdam marked the starting line of the nuclear arms race that would define the Cold War for decades to come.
It's incredible how much hinged on these conferences.
Yeah,
We're talking about decisions that reverberated throughout the entire 20th century.
it's true.
But before we dive into the what-ifs and the long-term consequences, let's shift gears slightly and delve a bit deeper into the agreements and disagreements that arose from each of these conferences.
Absolutely. Let's start by heading back to Yalta. So back to Yalta in 1945,
Okay.
while the fate of Eastern Europe loomed large, there were other crucial decisions on the table.
Right.
One key example is the agreement to divide Germany itself into occupied zones.
Okay.
On the surface, it seemed like a practical solution.
Okay.
The Allied powers would each administer a zone, helping Germany rebuild and transition to peace.
Okay.
But like a seemingly simple recipe that goes wrong.
Okay.
The ingredients weren't quite balanced.
Okay, I'm sensing some BG brewing here.
Yeah.
What went wrong with this seemingly sensible plan?
Well, for starters, the division of Germany wasn't just geographic, it was ideological.
Okay.
The US, UK, and France controlled West Germany, promoting democracy and capitalism.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Soviet zone in East Germany became a testing ground for communism. Imagine trying to bake one cake with half the batter made for democracy and the other half for communism.
Yeah.
It's bound to clash.
A recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So right there in the conference room, were they aware of how this division could potentially backfire?
There were definitely warning signs.
Okay.
Even the agreement on Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, became a microcosm of the larger conflict. The city itself was split, with West Berlin becoming an island of democracy within communist East Germany.
So the seeds of the Berlin Wall and all the tension that came with it were sown right there.
Precisely.
Wow.
Yalta was a mix of hope and compromise,
Yeah.
but also rife with unspoken anxieties.
Yeah.
It brings us back to that question we touched on earlier.
Okay.
Was the Cold War inevitable? Did these conferences solidify an us versus them mentality that was already brewing?
It's a huge question, and I have to admit, I find myself going back and forth.
Yeah.
What are the arguments for inevitability? And what evidence challenges that view?
Let's start with what some historians call the traditionalist view.
Right.
They argue the ideological chasm between capitalism and communism was simply too vast to bridge.
Okay.
Like oil and water, they were destined to repel each other.
Oh.
The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe only solidified this fear in the West.
So from that perspective, the conferences were less about preventing a Cold War and more about each side maneuvering for the best position once it inevitably arrived.
Exactly. But then we have the revisionist historians.
Okay.
They see the Cold War as a tragedy born more from miscommunication and missed opportunities than inherent incompatibility.
So they'd say there were paths not taken at these conferences that could have led to a different outcome.
Yes. And a prime example is the way the U.S. handled the atomic bomb.
Okay.
Initially, they kept its development secret from the Soviets, even though they were wartime allies.
Right.
Imagine finding out a friend had achieved something huge and kept it under wraps.
Yeah.
You'd feel a bit betrayed, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. That kind of secrecy rarely breeds trust.
Especially between superpowers.
Exactly. When Truman informed Stalin about the bomb at Potsdam, it confirmed the Soviets' worst fears.
Yeah.
That the U.S. was aiming for a nuclear monopoly, not a partnership.
Right.
Some revisionists argue that more transparency from the start, perhaps even a collaborative effort to control this terrifying new technology, could have fostered more trust.
Instead of being a bargaining chip, the bomb could have been a bridge.
Right.
It really makes you think about the importance of open communication, especially when the stakes are incredibly high.
And that's the crux of the revisionist argument, that misunderstandings fueled by fear on both sides escalated tensions unnecessarily.
Right.
Remember, both the U.S. and USSR emerged from World War II deeply scarred.
Of course.
The U.S., despite victory, was haunted by Pearl Harbor and the rise of fascism.
Right.
The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable casualties and harbored deep mistrust towards the West from previous conflicts.
Right. Trauma has a way of making people see threats even where they may not exist.
It's true. It's like that saying, when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Both sides were primed to interpret every action through the lens of their own trauma and ideology.
Right.
This worst-case thinking led to a spiral of suspicion making cooperation increasingly difficult.
So where do you stand on this? Was the Cold War inevitable, or were there genuine chances for a different path?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And like most things in history, the answer is far more nuanced than a simple yes or no.
Right.
Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between.
Go on. Intrigue me.
It's possible that while a Cold War wasn't inevitable in the truest sense, the conditions were ripe for it to occur.
Okay.
The ideological divide, the security concerns, the lack of trust, these factors created a tinderbox.
Right.
It might have taken a Herculean effort, a level of diplomacy and understanding that was perhaps impossible in that historical moment to prevent the spark that ignited the Cold War.
So even if the Cold War wasn't like preordained, it sounds like these conferences set the stage for decades of tension.
They did.
Does that mean we're doomed to repeat these patterns, though?
Well,
I mean, looking at current events, it's easy to feel like we're still grappling with the same issues.
it's a valid concern. History doesn't repeat itself verbatim,
Right.
but it often rhymes.
Right.
Take the war in Ukraine, for example.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of those geopolitical fault lines drawn during the Cold War.
Right.
Russia's desire for a buffer zone,
Hmm?
the West's commitment to NATO expansion.
Right.
These aren't just abstract ideas.
Right.
They're rooted in the very real anxieties and ambitions we've been discussing.
So how do we break out of these cycles then?
What?
If these conferences offer any lessons, it's that diplomacy is messy.
Oh, yeah.
Power is a slippery slope, and even with the best of intentions, things can go sideways fast.
Absolutely. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is the danger of simplistic narratives.
Okay.
We can't reduce complex events like Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam to a good guys versus bad guys story.
Right.
The Cold War wasn't just a clash between two monolithic ideologies.
Right.
It was shaped by individual leaders, domestic pressures, economic factors, and that looming threat of nuclear annihilation.
We're talking about real people making decisions under incredible pressure with the weight of history on their shoulders.
Exactly, and that's why understanding history is so crucial.
Right.
Not to glorify the past or point fingers,
Right.
but to learn from it.
Yeah.
To recognize those patterns of behavior that can lead to conflict.
Sure.
We need to be wary of those us versus them narratives that reduce complex issues to simplistic binaries.
So instead of viewing the past as like a roadmap to be followed or avoided,
Right.
it's more like a cautionary tale, urging us to be more aware, more nuanced in our understanding of global events.
Precisely, the more we understand about the forces that have shaped our world, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges of the present.
I love that knowledge is a compass, not a cage.
It is.
It's empowering, actually.
Yeah, it is. And in today's world where information overload is the norm, cultivating critical thinking is more vital than ever.
Right.
Question those assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Seek out diverse perspectives.
Right.
Dig deeper than the headlines.
Do your own deep dives, so to speak.
Exactly.
Which, hey, is what we're all about here.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Challenge your own biases, engage in thoughtful dialogue, and never underestimate the power of understanding the why behind the what when it comes to history and current events.
Well said. This has been such a fascinating journey.
It has.
From the battlefields of World War II
Yeah.
to the conference rooms where the future was being negotiated, all the way to the echoes of those decisions we still feel today.
It's true.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you walked away with not just a better understanding of these pivotal conferences, but also with a sense of curiosity about the nuances of history and how they shape our world.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep those brain cells buzzing.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.